Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This is Avoid the Earthbound Spirit Trap. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon real quick. If you're interested in supporting the work of Astral Club, and that work is very much appreciated, you can do so. You get advanced episodes on Sunday, a library of downloaded episodes for your podcast app, and there's a Patreon email where we can talk back and forth. And before I forget, just want to mention we've got a couple new supporters on Patreon. We got Planet 42, who's an Astral Scout, and Claire, who is an Astral Master. If you're interested, there is a link in the description. Next up, if you'd like to have a private astral projection lesson with me, I'd be glad to do that, help you learn how to astral project. If you're interested, there is an email in the description. Just send me a request for info and I'll send it on off to you. Okay, what I'd like to discuss is being trapped on the earthbound plane. Now, in the past, I've talked quite a bit about the subject, but usually in the sense of spirits who were drug addicted, like the Kensington, Philadelphia experience I told you about, or alcoholics who I told you after they pass will flock to the dive bars that they used to get drunk in. Maybe sex addicts being attracted to various areas, and violent people who seeking out the thrill of fighting and violence that they used to enjoy, or perhaps seeking out vengeance on whoever it is who did them violence. But what I want to discuss here is that literally anyone who is unprepared can end up trapped on the earth plane for at least some period of time. So no one's safe unless we discuss this information and how you can help ensure that this won't happen to you, no matter what the circumstances are of your passing. What I'm using as an example here is The Projection of the Astral Body by Sylvan Muldoon. Now, this book was first printed in London in 1929. It was reprinted in paperback in 1973, right after the 1972 publication of a little book called Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. So, even though this book was written long before I was born in this lifetime, it was the second book that I read, and I enjoyed it because they didn't get into a lot of fancy stuff. And back when I read this, I was only 12 years old, so my projections were fairly pedestrian in nature. But the thing that I like to read about in these astral projection books isn't the fancy stuff. It's the little things that I see that they talk about. And those little things are things that tell me that this person actually experienced astral projection. And they're not just dreaming up something that they read in a book once. Now, of course, since the book is almost 100 years old, you have to understand that there's a couple weird terms that they use that was used back then, especially in the psychic circles in the 20s, and also their cultural sensitivities were a little different. I mean, for instance, they might use the word in this book. They do use the word Orientals, which was the polite term back then. Of course, now it's considered an offensive term, and we would much rather say East Asian or something like that. But I imagine in 100 years from now, there'll be folks who are shocked at how we speak. And in a possible future, thousands of years from now, we're thought of as gods who were arrogant, who destroyed themselves. So I guess what I'm saying is let's be a little less judgmental about the past, because we're going to be judged too. And as the Bible says, judge not lest you be judged. Okay, at any rate, Sylvan Muldoon tells this story from when he was a kid. And it was in the summertime of 1916. And there was a violent wind and a rainstorm in the location where he lived. And he, after the storm was over, he and a boy next door went, walking on down the street. And they saw some electric power lines had snapped and the wires were hanging down from the pole. And so using kid logic, he wanted to ascertain whether the wire was live. Now keep in mind the sidewalks were still wet too. And he was not wearing anything rubber on his feet or anything that might, protect him. So evidently he found out pretty quickly when he got close to that wire. I don't know whether it was carried by the water or he touched it directly. But the bottom line is it was a live wire. Next thing he knew was blackness. For about 5 minutes, he estimates, he was completely unconscious. Then, for the next 5 minutes, he was out of his body, standing next to his prone body. And what was worse is because he was so close to his body, he was still feeling the pain that the physical body was experiencing. And that can happen when you're very close. When you're very close within that type of a chord activity range, you can get dual sensations, not only from the astral, but also from the physical. So this was not a fun sensation for him. And he was just lying there trying to communicate with his friends. And typically as kids, they didn't know what to do. But eventually they went and they got help. And somebody showed up with some rubber boots on. And they thought they were just going to disconnect a corpse from that wire because he'd been in contact with it for so long. But to the astonishment of the examining physician, which he went to after the accident, he was fine. And so he has these interesting memories from what was not quite a near-death experience, because obviously his physical body was still functioning enough that he didn't go into the typical near-death experience. He was there, in the astral, experiencing the pain that was being related to him from his physical body through the astral cord. But the real interesting bit is is the crux of the matter, what I want to talk about and what you have to do to avoid this becoming a problem for you. Because you don't need to have any of these problems or addictions. All you need is some trauma in your life, or some PTSD, or a predilection towards depression. At any rate, what happened to Sylvan here is that almost every night after this tragedy, he dreamed that he was being electrocuted again. And in this dream, he would live through the whole experience again, exactly as it happened. So this is something that was not well understood 100 years ago. But now we have things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We learn that when trauma is inflicted upon the body, whether it be physical trauma or mental trauma, that the brain reacts in various ways with people. In some cases, it will react with replays during dreams of the trauma. There's people who've been in combat who have PTSD when they're awake. I knew a Vietnam vet who had troubles on July 4th because with all those firecrackers and explosions going off, he'd have all kinds of Vietnam flashbacks because he was out there in the field. He was a grunt. He'd seen a lot, and you could tell it in his eyes. He didn't talk an awful lot about it, but you could see it in his eyes. So, it looks like we've got this way of dealing with trauma encoded into us. So what can we do about it? Well, starting while we're alive, work through the trauma. Talk with someone. I don't care whether it's a trusted friend, a relative, a therapist, and if you've got any non-physical beings that you believe in or trust, then certainly don't be afraid to discuss it with them as well. It's well known that discussing these things rather than bottling them up can assist in the process of dissipating, lessening the effects of trauma. It also starts to give you skills in which to handle it. And you can get that through therapy as well. If you find yourself at any time reliving or dwelling on negative experiences that happened to you in the past, work through them. You don't want that monkey being carried on your back. Get used to when you're confronted with that depressive state, when you're confronted with those unpleasant memories and traumas. Get used to, okay, this is what's happening to me right now. I have control over this. I can start thinking about the blessings in my life. I can talk with a religious official I trust. I can talk with a therapist or a trusted friend or relative and get it out of you. Get used to asking for help and sharing. This is important because should you be unlucky enough to pass from some sort of a traumatic situation, something that happens very suddenly or tragically, you may be confronted with trauma immediately after your passing in the astral. If you're used to the process of dealing with this trauma, of dealing with that PTSD, of working through this depressive state, asking for help, being open to help, you'll react the same way once you pass over. We've mentioned haunted houses in the past, and quite often, for instance, if somebody was, say, murdered in a house, they always talk about how the murder victim is the ghost that's been inhabiting this particular house. They never mention that it's the murderer. And I think the reason for that is the murderer isn't suffering from the trauma. They're not suffering from the PTSD. The chances are they're made a little differently than most of us. But that person who was traumatized by this unexpected violent attack, let's say, or a sudden earthquake, or sudden tornado or hurricane, or any number of things like car crashes, any one of these things can occur. So if we train ourselves to handle this type of trauma in the physical, it will be a second nature to us to handle it when we pass over. And that can save you some period of purgatory, if you want to use the Catholic term, which, is a word symbolizing not in heaven, not in hell. You're kind of in this gray neutral area. But you don't want to be in the lower astral for any length of time. It's unpleasant. And if you're aware of the problem and you're prepared to handle it, then it'll become like a reflex, even if you pass over unexpectedly. So That's my advice here. And I want to thank Sylvan Muldoon and his book, The Projection of the Astral Body, my second favorite astral projection book. And I recommend you buy that book or download it or whatever it is you want to do, because it's also an excellent book for people who are new to astral projection. Just like Robert Monroe's Journeys Out of the Body. Some other books out there get a little bit more advanced, and that can be a little bit too much for new people sometimes. But it's an excellent book, and it's always near my bedside table or my work table, one or the other. At any rate, if you like this, please hit the like button, share it with those of like mind. Subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure that bell is solid so you're notified on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning when I broadcast new podcasts. And just giving anybody some heads up. On the 27th of June, I'm going to be having another interview. This one's going to be live, so I guess questions will be able to be available. And that was with Rod, who I had been interviewed by him a while back. So I'll notify you about it again, and maybe some sort of invitation. I'll send out something letting you know that this is going to happen. Okay, once again, this is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.